Hi, this is lecture 2 of session 11 of the metabolism module. My name is Dr. Majid El Aboud, and I will talk about the pituitary and adrenal glands. We have several learning objectives to be covered during this lecture. First, I will list the hormones that are produced by the pituitary and adrenal glands and their functions. Then I will describe the structure of the steroid hormones. And thirdly, I will explain how the steroid hormones will affect their target tissues and how they exert their action. And then I will explain how cortisol secretion is controlled by the adrenocorticotrophic hormone and the CRH, the corticotrophic releasing hormone. And finally, I will describe the structure and functions of the adrenaline. So the pituitary gland is the master of all endocrine glands in the body because it controls all the other glands' secretion. It is a small gland that is located at the base of the brain, as you can see here. So it is uh, surrounded by a bony structure. So it is located in a recess in a fossa called the pituitary fossa inside the sphenoid sinus and the sphenoid bone in order to protect the pituitary gland from any harm because it is very important and very precious gland. And this gland is suspended from the above structure, which is called the hypothalamus, by a stalk. It weighs around zero point 0.5 to zero point 0.9 gram and is larger in females. Why is that? Because as you know, in females, they have the estrogen hormone as well as the prolactin, which is secreted from the lactotrophs. And the prolactin hormone is important for lactation. The pituitary gland, as you can see here, is divided into two lobes. The anterior lobe, which is originally derived from the buccal ectoderm, and it is called the adenohypophysis. And the name adeno means it is endocrine or a gland. And we have the posterior lobe, which is uh, derived from the hypothalamus, and it is called the neurohypophysis. And the structure of each lobe is totally different from the other. During this semester, we will talk about and discuss the anterior pituitary gland. And later on, you will take the posterior pituitary gland or the neurohypophysis. This is a real histopathological transverse section of the pituitary gland. As you can see, this is the red colored or pink colored part is the anterior pituitary lobe, which is called the adenohypophysis. It contains many types of cells that secrete different types of hormones that we are going to talk about later. And it is separated by connective tissue from the posterior pituitary gland, which is called the neurohypophysis, which is lighter in color as you can see here. So the anterior lobe is the major lobe that secretes many hormones. And this is a magnified photo of the same slide. As you can see here, there are different types of cells that secrete different hormones. Some of them are red in color, some of them are blue in color, and we have the posterior lobe, which is called the the neurohypophysis, and this is the adenohypophysis, and this is the separating band between both of the two lobes of the pituitary gland. As I said, the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland secretes many hormones. Actually, there are six. What are these hormones? They are very essential to control other glands function in the body. We have first of all the TSH or the thyroid stimulating hormone. It is secreted by cells called the thyrotrophs, and it stimulates the thyroid gland to secrete thyroxine T3 and T4. The second hormone is called the ACTH, or adrenocorticotropic hormone. It is secreted by the corticotrophs, and the action of the ACTH is to stimulate the adrenals, and specifically it acts on the adrenal cortex to secrete cortisol and to lesser extent sex hormones. Then we have the growth hormone. And by the way, the growth hormone secreting cells are the largest cells in the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland, the most abundant, abundant type of cells that is present in the anterior lobe is secreting the growth hormone. So these cells are called somatotrophs, and the word somato means growth of the body. And it's very clear that the growth hormone promotes growth, very essential, especially during childhood, it promotes the growth. And then we have two hormones called gonadotrophs. These are the LH and the FSH. The LH is the luteinizing hormone, and the FSH is the follicular stimulating hormone. These two hormones are secreted by the gonadotrophs cells, and the function of the gonadotrophin is to stimulate the gonads. And by the gonads, we mean the ovaries in females and testes in males. So in females, FSH and LH will stimulate the secretion of estrogen and progesterone, and hence it will regulate the process of ovulation. While in males, LH and FSH will stimulate the secretion of testosterone from the testes, and as well as they will stimulate the process of spermatogenesis. So in fact, FSH stimulates the secretion of testosterone, and LH will stimulate the process of spermatogenesis. And then we have prolactin, and the prolactin is secreted from the lactotrophs of the pituitary gland. And lacto means milk, as you know. And obviously prolactin is important hormone for milk production. That is why usually it is higher in females, especially during a pregnancy and lactation. And this is the reason why the pituitary gland is slightly larger in females compared to males. Now let's talk about the other gland, that is the adrenal glands. In fact, there are two glands, and they cap the upper poles of the kidneys, as you can see here. So there are small glands located just above the upper pole of both kidneys and just below the diaphragm. The weight of these glands is around 6 to 8 grams, and they are slightly smaller in females than in males for unknown reason. And there are two regions in each adrenal gland, an outer region called the cortex and inner region called the medulla. And the adrenal glands are very important because they secrete important hormones. So the cortex, or the outer layer of the adrenal gland, secretes three types of hormones. The first one that we call it the mineralocorticoids, and this includes the aldosterone. And the aldosterone is an important hormone that regulates the body sodium and potassium level. So aldosterone will cause increase in the level of sodium and decrease in the level of potassium. And the second type of hormones that are secreted by the adrenal gland are very important stress hormone called glucocorticoids. An example of it is cortisol and corticosterone. And these are the hormones of stress. We need them whenever we are exposed to stress. And they have many actions, but mainly they regulate carbohydrate metabolism, as we can see later on. The third type of hormone is called the androgen. And the androgens that are secreted from the adrenal gland is mainly the dihydroepiandrosterone or DHEA. And this is the male sex hormone. So in addition to testosterone that is secreted from the testes, we have another sex hormone in males called the dihydroepiandrosterone, which is available in smaller quantities in females as well. And then we have the inner layer of the adrenal gland, which is called the medulla. And the medulla is responsible for secretion of adrenaline or epinephrine. And in fact, the medulla is a neural tissue, an expansion of the neural tissue rather than a glandular tissue. And they keep the adrenaline in vesicles and they release the adrenaline when the body needs adrenaline. So here is very important slide that shows you the layers of the adrenal gland from, if we start from the outside to the inside. So at the bottom of the picture you can see here is the capsule of the adrenal gland. So this is the capsule, and then we have, this is the adrenal cortex, and the inner layer is called the adrenal medulla. And if you have a closer look on the adrenal cortex, you can see three types of layer within the adrenal cortex. The outer layer is called zona glomerulosa, and it is responsible for secretion of aldosterone. And then we have the wider layer of the adrenal cortex, which is called the zona fasciculata, and it is responsible for secretion of glucocorticoids. And that's why it is the wider layer of the adrenal cortex, because we need very large quantities of glucocorticoids during stressful situation and during our daily life. And then we have the inner layer, which is called zona reticularis, and these cells in the zona reticularis are responsible for secretion of the sex hormones, the dihydroepiandrosterone. In order not to forget these names as it's difficult to remember them, remember always the GFR. So I think you've taken the glomerular filtration rate in the kidneys, GFR. Here also we have GFR. Starting from the outside, G stands for glomerulosa, F for fasciculata, and R for reticularis. And remember always the middle layer is the larger layer, which is responsible for secretion of glucocorticoids, and we call it fasciculata. And the outer layer is responsible for secretion of aldosterone, while the inner layer is responsible for secretion of sex hormone. And in this way, you will never forget the names of these types of cells or layers. And then we have the adrenal medulla, which is responsible for secretion of catecholamines like adrenaline. So what is the structure of the steroid hormones? Cortisol is a member of the C21 steroid family, and we call it C21 because there are 21 carbon atoms in the structure of the steroid on the cortisol. But they are different from each other steroids in three main factors. The first one is the number of carbon atoms. So we said that in cortisol the number is 21. Other steroids there are a different number. So if you calculate the number of these carbon atoms, they will be 21 in cortisol. Second is the presence of functional groups. This is called the functional groups. Through it, the hormone will exert its function. So there are different types of functional groups, which is characteristic of the hormone and can differentiate cortisol from other steroid hormones. And finally, we can differentiate between them by the distribution of the double bond of the carbon atoms that attach each carbon to atom to one atom. So here an example of the double bond. So by these double bonds that connect two carbon atoms, The distribution is different from one molecule to another, and by this way we can differentiate structure of cortisol from other steroid family. Cortisol is a lipophilic, and you know lipophilic means it lacks lipid, so it is soluble in fat, but it is insoluble in water. And they are synthesized from cholesterol via the effect of the hormone progesterone. So how does cortisol transported in the plasma? Cortisol is a lipophilic, as I said, and therefore it cannot be transported in the plasma unless it is bound to a plasma protein. This plasma protein, which is seen here in this picture, is called the transcortin. And majority of the cortisol in the plasma is bound to the transcortin. And only 10% of the total cortisol is free. And this 10% that is free cortisol is the biologically active, which means it is the one that acts. And the other 90%, which is bound to protein transcortin, is not active. So how does cortisol exert its action on the target cells? As we said, cortisol is a lipophilic, so it can cross the plasma membrane freely of the target cells. And when it enters the plasma membrane, through the plasma membrane into the cytoplasm of the target cell, it will bind to a special receptor called cortisol receptor. And this hormone receptor complex, the cortisol and the cortisol receptor complex, will enter the nucleus of the cell and will interact with a specific region of the DNA of the nucleus. This interaction between the complex of the hormone and the receptor with the DNA sequence will change the rate of transcription of specific genes and may take time to occur. And by changing the sequence or the transcription of specific genes on the DNA, by the end, it will result in the formation of a different messenger RNA, which will result in the formation of a different protein that will exert the action at the end. And as the usual story with all hormones in the endocrine system, cortisol secretion is under control. And as we said in the beginning, the pituitary gland is the major gland that controls all other glands. So how does pituitary gland control cortisol secretion? So whenever there is a stress or circadian rhythm, by stress we mean, for example, infection, fever, illness, disease, or emotional stress like extreme fear or sadness, or any trauma. So any stressful situation will stimulate the hypothalamus. In addition, usually in our body there is a circadian rhythm, which means there is a secretion of CRH even in the absence of stressful situation. There is secretion of corticotrophy releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, usually during the early morning hours. That's why in the early morning hours the level of cortisol is the highest. And the CRH will stimulate the anterior pituitary gland to secrete the adrenocorticotrophic hormone, which will stimulate the adrenal cortex to secrete the cortisol. And the cortisol has several actions. It will act on the immune system and it will suppress the immune system. Therefore, sometimes we can use steroids, synthetic steroids as drugs to suppress immunity in autoimmune diseases. It will act on the liver and will stimulate the process of gluconeogenesis, because cortisol is a stress hormone, is a catabolic hormone, so we need it during the time of stress to increase the energy in the body through the process of gluconeogenesis to provide the body with the glucose as a source of energy. Also, it will act on the muscles and will result in a protein catabolism and a breakdown, and it will act on the adipose tissue and will cause lipolysis. This is in usual levels or ordinary normal levels or physiological levels. It will cause lipolysis. But in higher levels, such as when we give the patient higher doses of synthetic steroid, it will cause lipogenesis and obesity. So again, let's review that. So whenever there is a stimulant to the hypothalamus, there will be secretion of corticotrophin releasing hormone, which will stimulate the anterior pituitary to secrete the precursor of the adrenocorticotropic hormone. The precursor is called the POMC, proomiomelanocortin. This is a larger molecule that will break down into two molecules, ACTH and melanocyte stimulating hormone, MSH. And because the structure of the melanocyte stimulating hormone is present inside the ACTH as well, ACTH has similar activity to MSH, melanocyte stimulating hormone, at higher levels. That's why people who have high level of ACTH will have tanned or dark skin. Why? Because ACTH has similar effect to melanocyte stimulating hormone, and then it will stimulate the melanocyte in the skin to produce the melanin, the skin pigmentation that will make the skin looks darker. And then the ACTH will stimulate the adrenal cortex to produce cortisol, and cortisol has several actions that we said. What about the hormones that are secreted from the adrenal medulla, that is the catecholamines? The catecholamines are synthesized from tyrosine. Tyrosine will be converted into dopamine, and dopamine will be converted into noradrenaline, and finally noradrenaline will be converted into adrenaline. And these catecholamines are stored in the medullary cells and membrane limited vesicles. So the adrenal medulla represent a store for the adrenaline to be secreted whenever the body needs it. The action of adrenaline is very simple. We need adrenaline during what is called the flight, fight, fright response. Flight, fright, and fight response. So we need adrenaline whenever we are exposed to a situation that requires running away, for example, or fighting, or becoming anxious and angry. So it's very easy to remember these actions. If we remember that adrenaline is the hormone that is needed during the fight, flight, and the fright situations. So it will act on the heart, it will increase the cardiac output. How it does that? First of all, it will increase the heart rate, it will cause tachycardia, and it will increase the amount of blood pumped by the heart. Therefore, it will increase the cardiac output. Second, it will increase the blood supply to the muscles as a result of increasing cardiac output. Because when we need to run away, we need a large amount of blood supply to the muscles to act. And it will act on the central nervous system, on the brain. It will increase mental alertness. So during the time of a frightening, of extreme fear, our mental alertness will be very high because of the adrenaline. Also, it will act on the liver and the muscle and will increase the glycogenolysis. Why is that? Because during this stressful situation, the frightening situation, we need an extra source of energy from the muscles and the liver. Similarly, it will act on the adipose tissue and it will increase lipolysis in order to supply the body with fatty acids as a source of energy. And thank you.